I've been asking for this for quite some time. Wanted to know what the polling data will show. And of course, I think there are a lot of polls that are being conducted as we speak as a result of this past weekend's disclosures associated with the Russian collusion. That wasn't, but that's okay. There are several other items, though, that have been percolating, I like that term, in Washington, D.C., one of them being the elimination of the Electoral College. And joining us this afternoon is Donald Bryson, the CEO of the Civitas Institute. By the way, that website is nccivitas.org, nccivitas.org. And we're chatting with him about the recent polling data, which shows that not a lot of people are very supportive of the Electoral College being, being removed. Donald, and good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Lockwood. Always happy to be on with you. And yes, the Electoral College, it's a confusing issue to those of us that understand it. But it appears that if you ask people, or at least likely voters in North Carolina, pretty straightforward, if they would like the president to be elected by the popular vote or by the Electoral College, 43% say they would like the Electoral College, 47% say that they would like the national popular vote.
No.
However, there's a bill down at the General Assembly that would enter North Carolina into sort of an interstate compact with other states, and these states would agree that no matter what the outcome was in their states, that they would give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And when you ask people about that, they turn very heavily against the Electoral College the national popular vote.
You know, that's quite frankly a smart move, since that will give a better understanding and clarity as to what the elimination of the Electoral College would have on our system of government. The other aspect of this, I'm curious about this bill that's being presented, Donald. Is this as a result of a Democrat or independents who are pushing this bill?
The Democrats are pushing this bill, and we've seen one state already pass it, with Colorado. Governor Hickenlooper having signed that bill out there. Of course, he's announced that he would run for president, which is interesting. But I know this is being pushed in several states. This has been presented in the state Senate. I believe it's Senate Bill 104. If people want to go to the website of the General Assembly to look up Senate Bill 104 and look at what that would mean. But yes, this is presented by Democrats, sponsored by Democrats, being pushed by Democrats.
Okay.
And that sort of bears out in the Electoral College versus popular vote crosstabs, because Trump voters from 2016 are for the Electoral College at 75%, whereas Clinton voters are for the popular vote at 74%.
Okay, so one can imagine why there. Let's talk about that since you brought up the presidential election. How does President Trump poll in North Carolina? And again, we're chatting with Donald Bryson, CEO of the Civitas Institute. Donald, how does Trump line up in light of and I think this poll was done in advance, I'm assuming, in advance of the notification related to the Mueller report.
It was done in advance of the Mueller report. We did this poll March 14th through the 17th. Of course, we'll do this poll again in May and then again in June. But we pretty consistently poll the president's and the governor's approval ratings. And President Trump has shown remarkable consistency over our last three polls. This month, he was at 47% favor, 49% unfavor, which is essentially a statistical tie in a poll that has a 4.38% margin of error. So, he's been sort of around that 49, 47, either for or against mark for the past three polls. And so what that should tell you is that, while he can be a polarizing figure, President Trump is not necessarily overwhelmingly unpopular or overwhelmingly popular.
Right, and of course it may have be greatly influenced as a result of the decision by the special prosecutor not to pursue any further indictments, and for that matter, basically saying, okay, there was no proof of collusion. The other aspect of this, and let's talk about this in relationship of down balloting, because we do have some other major elections coming up. Of course, we've got two very significant elections underway right now in both the North Carolina 3rd and 9th congressional districts. But let's look at this in relationship to the gubernatorial race. How is now the governor polling in North Carolina?
Oh, the governor's polling very well. As he typically does. He has a 58% approval rating right now, in just looking at his job approval, which is really good. It's the number that you want if you're an incumbent right now. But that support is pretty soft. When we ask these questions, we ask people, do you approve or do you disapprove? And then we ask if that is strongly approve or somewhat disapprove or strongly disapprove, et cetera. And the percentage of people that strongly approve are only at 22%. So that means that a lot of people approve of what he's doing, but only somewhat. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he's generally undefined. He doesn't have a lot of public appearances. I think there are a lot of people in North Carolina that don't know a lot about Governor Cooper, but things seem to be going pretty well in North Carolina, so that seems the governor must be doing a good job.
Well, the other aspect of this, and of course the governor is being scrutinized, for want of a better description right now, by members of the legislature over his handling of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. That seems to be somewhat of a cloud over the governor's head at this point, does it not?
It does. It sort of seems like a storm cloud that could really bring a lot of rain and thunder. Everybody's just sort of waiting to see what the cloud's going to bring. Essentially we're just sort of waiting because the administration did a data dump to members of the press of about 19,000 pages. People are still trying to sort through that. There's still some other interviews that need to be done by the General Assembly in what seems to be sort of a pay-to-play type situation,
right,
between Governor Cooper, some solar companies, and, of course, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which is co-owned by Duke Energy and Dominion Energy.
Right, and, of course, the issue of transparency as well. Speaking of transparency, I want to touch on that in a moment. And by the way, for those who are wondering, our guest is on the road, and, we'll just deal with the road noise. We're going to have to work on the new tires, though, for you, Donald. Donald
Sorry
Bryson.
about that.
No problem. Donald Bryson of the Civitas Institute with us. Donald, what about the issue of Tom Tillis? How did he poll in this recent survey?
Well, we asked people about a few statewide offices, including Senator Tillis. Have you heard of this person? Have you not heard of this person? If you have, is your opinion favorable or unfavorable? And Senator Tillis came out slightly different from what he was when we asked this back in November. But his favorability is at 26%. His unfavorable is at 33%. 24% of people said they have heard of him but have no opinion, which is interesting considering they just elected him 5 years ago. And then, of course, there's 14% who said they've never heard of Senator Tillis. And those last two numbers are particularly interesting, which means that 38% of likely voters have either heard of him and have no opinion or have never heard of him at all. Wow. That I don't know what that says about the electorate in North Carolina. That more than a third of people haven't heard of the U.S. senator or one of our two U.S. senators, but that does seem to be the situation. Obviously, Senator Tillis has more favorability among Republicans than he does among Democrats. But we also asked this question of Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest, and Lieutenant Governor Forest, interestingly enough, has a higher favorability rating among Republicans than Senator Tillis does.
Wow. One other quick question for you related to Senator Tillis. Of course, the dispute over the southern border, the wall, the fact that the senator initially wrote a letter to the editor and op-ed piece, actually in the Washington Post, opposed to the president's endeavors, but then later shifting his vote, which, of course, created a hue and cry from Democrats. What impact did that have on this? Was that premature at that point? It
was a little premature. Our poll was conducted after he had written the op-ed that went in the Washington Post, but it was before he had changed his vote. And so I'm sure that changed it. It got a lot of publicity, but it's hard to know exactly how it changed his favorability. I'm sure that it did, but, Senator Tillis has an election coming up next year, so we'll continue to track this. And that's the useful thing about the Civitas poll. And if people want to look at it, they can go to nccivitas.org.
Right.
But that we track these things over time, and we can see how things change historically.
All right. And one other item you've got in your release, and I want to go to this very quickly, and that having to do with a constitutional initiative to, if you will, define and I would say limit the concept of eminent domain. That is the taking of private property for public use and benefit. What's the interest there on the part of your vote or the voters?
Well, that came out a little different than what it has in the past. We've polled this several times over the past 15 years at Civitas, and usually this comes out in the 60s and a couple of times in the low 70s. This time we took pains to put more explanation into the wording, and maybe this actually hurt how it came out. But it turns out that only about 51% of people support changing the constitutional amendment, which is still a majority, and that's still a good thing. But it's much lower than what we anticipated. So that was 51% total in favor of this constitutional amendment of changing the eminent domain language in the Constitution from public use and benefit to just public use. And we had 31% opposed.
All right. And one other quick question for you before we let you go. And again, I'll just remind folks, you go to the website, nccivitas.org. You can get this poll data there. And they have a lot of information here. I'm looking at crosstab and information, and I want to touch on one particular Council of State position. Now, obviously, the state Secretary of State, Elaine Marshall, she polls with favorables of 24%, unfavorable of 7%. Attorney General Josh Stein, favorable of 24%, unfavorable 8%. These are just favorables. And by the way, it was interesting to see a number of people who have more people have heard of Elaine Marshall than they've heard of Josh Stein, and very few people have a lot to do with the Secretary of State, but they have a lot to do with the Attorney General. The one Council of State race, which really surprises me, 43% have never heard of State Treasurer Dale Folwell, and yet he has been a topic of significant news coverage in North Carolina over the past, I've talked to him now for, 3 months consistently about the issue of controlling the state budget, bond referenda, the potential of going into debt, and specifically his concerns related to both the state pension plan and now, as we speak, the state health plan, and the fact that the legislature is involved in a significant dispute over this proposal that he wants to promote transparency. And yet only 32% have heard of him but have no opinion. That really, 43% have never heard of him. I'm stunned by that. Your observations.
Again, that says something about the electorate. Generally speaking, they just elected this guy, a couple years ago as state treasurer, and nearly half, 43%. Of likely voters say they've never heard of him. 20% have heard of him and have an opinion with a 14% favorability, 6% unfavorable, and then there's the other 32% who have heard of him but have no opinion. That's surprising. It's also surprising to a lot of people, I think, just honestly, Lockwood, that we elect a position like the state treasurer at all.
Right.
I'm not sure that they even realize that. Mm-hmm. And some people just skip over. They vote for president, vote for U.S. Senate, vote for governor, and then they quit. They're done. And I think that's unfortunate. Interestingly enough, in this poll regarding Treasurer Folwell, he actually has a higher favorability rating among Democrats than he does with Republicans. Republicans are 14% favorable to 4% unfavorable, and Democrats are 16% favorable, which is higher than Republicans, to 9% unfavorable.
I brought that up in the opening of the program that it is interesting. Democrats, though, have lined up with the treasurer on this issue of transparency with the state health plan and relationship to hospitals. And I made note of the fact that Scenic a renowned, almost progressive, but definitely liberal organization, State Employees Association of North Carolina, has come out foursquare in favor of Dale Folwell, a conservative Republican. That's the thing that surprised me.
Absolutely. If you look at these three Republicans on here, Tom Tillis, Dan Forrest, Dale Folwell, Dale Folwell is arguably the most conservative of the three, based on his voting record as in the General Assembly, and of course how he's been as state treasurer. But a lot of the things that Treasurer Folwell has done directly affect Scenic. He's trying to keep the state health plan under control. Of course, Scenic knows that if the costs of the state health plan don't get under control, there will be no state health plan.
Exactly.
And it's in their interest to keep it.
All right, I'm going to let you go because I know you have other commitments. Donald Bryson, I've kept you a little longer than anticipated. Thank you very much for being with us. CEO of the Civitas Institute, as I like to remind you, nccivitas.org. Donald, have a great day. Thanks for your time. Appreciate that, sir.
Thank you, Lockwood.
Viewpoints on the talk station, FM 107, AM 1240.